This is Kick-Ass News. I'm Ben Mathis. The 2020 presidential race is going to be the most high-stakes election in at least a generation, and it all starts in Iowa. Spotify presents Uncommitted, Iowa 2020, an original podcast from Vice News. Join host Antonia Hilton and Vice News reporters as they break down all the Iowa caucuses. Listen to Uncommitted, Iowa 2020 every Tuesday, free on Spotify. See Hollywood's biggest stars, Leonardo DiCaprio, Brad Pitt, and Margot Robbie in Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Time magazine says DiCaprio and Pitt are marvelous together. Now with over 20 minutes of additional scenes and exclusive access to the set. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Watch it now on digital. Rated R. Hi, I'm Ben Mathis. Welcome to Kick-Ass News. In 2003, Mikhail Khodorkovsky was believed to be the wealthiest man in Russia, with a fortune estimated to be worth $15 billion and ranked 16th on Forbes' list of billionaires. But then his life drastically changed when he was arrested by Russian authorities that same year and sentenced to 9 years in prison. What had he done wrong? According to the official charges, the oil mogul had, quote, created an organized group of individuals with the intention of taking control of the shares in Russian companies during the privatization process through deceit. Others would say that Khodorkovsky broke an unspoken rule between Russia's oligarchs and Russian President Vladimir Putin. As long as they stayed out of politics, they could continue to operate with impunity. But anyone who dared to challenge Putin stood to lose everything, including his freedom and even his life. Today, Mikhail Khodorkovsky lives in London, where he continues to speak out against the corruption and political oppression of Vladimir Putin's Russia, and now he's the subject of a fascinating new documentary by Oscar and Emmy-winning filmmaker Alex Gibney titled Citizen K. And today, Alex Gibney joins me on the podcast to talk about the parallel rise of Mikhail Khodorkovsky and Vladimir Putin amid the chaos of post-Soviet Russia, how Khodorkovsky was able to privatize state-run entities for pennies on the dollar, and how Putin went from a mid-level apparatchik in the Kremlin to Prime Minister of Russia within 3 years. He discusses the public showdown between these two men that put Khodorkovsky on Putin's enemies list, why Khodorkovsky refused to flee before he was arrested, and the personal transformation he underwent during his decade in a remote Russian prison. Alex shares how Khodorkovsky got out of prison and escaped Russia with $500 million in the bank, how the ex-patriot is now waging a political war against Vladimir Putin from London, and whether he worries that he might become another in the growing body count of Putin's enemies. Plus, Alex reveals what Mikhail Khodorkovsky knows about Russia's interference in the 2016 U.S. election, why Vladimir Putin employs a cast of actors to make himself look good, and what Khodorkovsky believes is Putin's greatest nightmare. Coming up with documentary filmmaker Alex Gibney in just a moment. Alex Gibney has been called the most consequential documentary filmmaker of our time. He won an Oscar and 7 Emmys for his work that includes, among other films, Going Clear, Scientology and the Prison of Belief, We Steal Secrets, The Story of WikiLeaks, Mea Maxi Culpa, Silence in the House of God, Enron, The Smartest Guy in the Room, Client 9, The Rise and Fall of Elliot Spitzer, Casino Jack and the United States of Money, and Taxi to the Dark Side. Now his latest film, Citizen K, takes a look at one of Russia's most controversial figures, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the Russian oil oligarch who ran afoul of Vladimir Putin and ended up spending 10 years in prison as a result. Citizen K opens in theaters November 22nd. Alex Gibney, welcome.
Thanks, man. Good to be here.
Well, you shot part of this documentary in Russia. Weren't you a little bit concerned about traveling to Russia to make a film about the man who is probably Vladimir Putin's biggest rival?
Well, it was a bit concerning, but everything went fine. We kept a low profile, And it was a lot easier shooting in Russia than it is shooting in China.
Oh, really? Interesting. How so?
Well, in China, at least the last time I shot there, you're always tailed by minders. Well, we may have been tailed. I certainly didn't notice it.
Interesting.
Our phones and computers were suffused with malware, but other than that, everything went fine.
In Citizen K, as I mentioned at the top, you profiled the Russian oil oligarch turned political prisoner and anti-Putin activist Mikhail Khodorkovsky. What did you find most compelling about the Khodorkovsky story?
Well, in the wake of the 2016 election, of course, I was interested, like most Americans were, in Russia. And I don't think we've been paying much attention to Russia and what had happened there since the fall of the Soviet Union. I was interested in how power worked in Russia, and the Khodorkovsky story seemed like a really good way of understanding it. He was a guy who rose up from nothing to become Russia's richest man, really, then went toe-to-toe with Putin, calling him out for corruption, spent 10 years in a Siberian prison, so now having been at the top, he was now at the very bottom. His only power was his ability to kill himself, which he threatened to do on a number of hunger strikes. And then he's finally sent in exile. He's pardoned and sent in exile and lives now in London as kind of an anti-Putin activist. So it seemed like a pretty good way of figuring out how Russia works.
And this film is also equally about this interesting era in Russian history that sort of gets lost between the Cold War and the Russia of Vladimir Putin, which is the gangster capitalism of the 90s in Russia. How did that ecosystem allow for a banker with relatively humble beginnings like Khodorkovsky to become a billionaire oligarch in a relatively short period of time?
Well, the answer was he wasn't even a banker when he started. He was selling black market blue jeans and computers. He may have been given a grub stake by somebody, but in any event, one of the things he did, like many of the oligarchs, was he began buying up these so-called vouchers. These, in the Soviet era, private enterprise was illegal. It wasn't just not practiced; it was illegal. In turning to capitalism, what they decided to do was, in the case of small to medium-sized companies, they issued a number of vouchers that represented a small stake in them. And they had a kind of a cash value, but for those people who were super smart and understood how the system worked, and very few people did, the system, that is to say, of capitalism, you could buy and sell those vouchers and pretty quickly end up with rather sizable stakes in a number of different companies. And that's what Khodorkovsky did. That led him then to become a banker, and he became a banker for a time, in charge of doling out pensions and salaries to government workers, and then used his clout as a banker ultimately to lend money to the government, which they couldn't pay back, which got him a globe-girdling oil company called Yukos. And that's how he got to be Russia's richest man. But that's a kind of shorthand for what was like the Wild West of capitalism. There were no rules, just the kind of world that many in the Republican Party would like us to return to.
And Khodorkovsky can be a little bit cagey when he's pressed about this part of his story and sort of only hints with a little bit of a grin at his own complicity in the corruption of the 90s. Was it challenging to get him to be forthcoming about that?
I think so. I mean, look, I think his view, and look, we have a lot of archive of him at the time talking about how effectively greed is good, how proud he was of being greedy. I think he saw it as a game. And he admits as much, and he says it was unfair. He doesn't go into as much detail as I might have liked, but I think it's true that in a world where there were no rules, he figured out how to take advantage, and he took ruthless advantage.
Mm-hmm. And one explanation that he leans on, and several other people bring up in this film, is they say what happened in Russia in the 90s is that the laws couldn't keep up with capitalism. Were a lot of the things that oligarchs like him did in the 90s technically legal at the time?
It's hard to know because the law was in such a fluid state. And that's, of course, what ultimately landed him in prison. You know, he was put in prison the first time for tax evasion. He wasn't doing anything different than anybody was doing at the time. That may or may not have been illegal, depending on how you interpreted the laws. The scary thing about Russia in the 90s was that the rule of law was both so anemic and so fluid. And it's a pretty, glaring example of what can happen when the rule of law is eviscerated.
Mm-hmm. And alongside this, we see this meteoric rise of Vladimir Putin, almost out of nowhere, it seems. He arrives in Moscow as a bureaucrat in Yeltsin's government, and I think within 3 years he was prime minister. I've always wondered, how did he manage that?
Well, he had interesting friends in powerful places, and ultimately he became a very good apparatchik, somebody who could get things done. And one oligarch, Boris Berezovsky, was particularly fond of him, as well as a close associate of Yeltsin's, a guy named Yumashev. And they kept pushing him forward with Yeltsin, so much so that on Y2K, that is to say the day all the clocks changed from the 90s to 2000, Putin was appointed president by Yeltsin. And so he didn't come in as an elected official. He was appointed to the position, which is interesting. He was not really a politician, except in the sense that he had the skill of an actor that he was able to amass, having been a spy, because he had been in the KGB and then the FSB. But also, once he got into power, he understood very quickly how to manipulate crises to his advantage, and also, ultimately, how to take over the means of communication, and particularly the two major networks, that literally made him into a kind of Bond-like superhero. So it was a really instructive rise to power that's not unlike, in some ways, our current president in the United States.
Right. And there is this subplot of the film, how you demonstrate how he consolidated control over the media, and particularly television. Now, we've all seen the propaganda of Putin riding horses with his shirt off and darting tigers, or traveling to remote villages and interacting with locals. And I heard that you said that those interactions with so-called everyday Russians are actually manufactured. They're actors, right?
Well, this is something that's not in the film, but something I learned since then. And I'm told, though I haven't confirmed, though others tell me it's accurate, is that when he does these sort of, vox pop moments where he goes by the side of the road and gets an ice cream cone, that if you do face recognition software, the people he interacts with are basically the same 10 people who are being sent around the country to play various roles. Oh, this week I want to be the ice cream guy. No, I want to be the banker this time. That kind of thing.
Now, when do Putin and Khodorkovsky's worlds begin to intersect?
Well, very quickly. I mean, Putin is appointed as president in 2000, literally as the clocks tick into the next century. And at the time, Khodorkovsky was one of Russia's richest men. He not only had been running a bank, but now was running, Russia's biggest oil company. So they were immediately going to come into contact. And it seemed like, Khodorkovsky himself says he thought, oh, geez, Putin is a reformer. He's a younger guy, a new generation. Things are going to work out great. That turned out not to be right. And there was a famous televised forum on corruption in 2003. And in that forum, Khodorkovsky literally called out Putin and accused him of corruption. A few months later, Khodorkovsky was in a Siberian prison.
I think what he was calling him out over was another company's purchase of a Russian oil company, I think in a sort of a no-bid contract type of deal. Is it fair to say that initially, at least, Khodorkovsky was really only interested in fighting corruption to the extent that it adversely affected his own business?
Well, I think that's right. And I think, I mean, it was to his advantage also in another way, which is he was interested in possibly merging with ExxonMobil. And to that end, suddenly it became enormously advantageous to him to engage in more transparent business practices so that he could actually engage in contracts with big business in the West. So I think it was in his interest for a number of reasons, possibly in order to vitiate rivals, but certainly to be able to pursue a very big deal with ExxonMobil, which Putin did not want done for a number of reasons. One is oil was considered very much of a national energy source that Putin wanted to maintain Russian control over, and two, the idea of bringing in transparent business methods to what had been a sort of gangster capitalist model was not something ultimately that was in his long-term interest. That is to say, Putin's long-term interest.
Now, after that televised showdown between Putin and Khodorkovsky, one can imagine that he probably had a good sense that the heat was on and knew that he was likely to be arrested at some point. Why didn't he just take the money and flee the country? Why did he stay?
That's the $100 million question. I asked him that question, and he said, he had a company to protect, and he wasn't going to give up his dignity, and he wasn't going to back down. Because there were a number of indicators, pretty strong indicators, that he was going to be arrested. A number of executives in his company were arrested before him. And so it was clear that things were closing in. I think there was a certain amount of arrogance to it. He had Khodorkovsky had amassed a lot of influence in the Russian Duma, the representative body in Russia. And he was a very powerful businessman. I think he perhaps he thought he could face down Putin, or if Putin was going to put him in prison, maybe he'd only have to do a year or two. But I think that it was a combination of hubris and also determination not to be pushed around by Putin.
And how bad was the prison where he was sent for 10 years?
It wasn't good. I mean, it was very far away. When his family wanted to visit him, it took them 5 days to get there. It's sort of where China and Mongolia and Russia all meet, and it's just a few miles from one of Russia's big uranium mines. There was a lot of hash dealers there. It was not a friendly sort of white-collar prison. It was a tough place, and in fact, in the middle of the night, one night, somebody tried to take out Khodorkovsky's eye with a shiv.
Wow!
So it was a tough place.
Yeah, and at one point, he starts using hunger strikes to protest. How did he come to that?
Well, the first time was in a sort of a local prison before he was sent off to Siberia, and one of his executives was put into a very rough jail. And Khodorkovsky protested that. He protested it with what he called a dry hunger strike. I hadn't realized that there was a distinction between dry and wet. But dry hunger strike means no food, no water. And that means you die very quickly. Your blood pressure rises. And you have to be sure that there's as Khodorkovsky explained to me, there's a goal that you can achieve very quickly, or else you're done. And I asked him in a sort of joking manner, so, did you succeed in getting your friend in better conditions? And he looked with a kind of a smile that had a lot of steel behind it and said, if I hadn't succeeded, I wouldn't be here, i.e. I'd be dead.
I wonder, is there any part of him that sort of accepts that you live by the sword and you die by the sword, regardless of the political motives behind his imprisonment? He was corrupt in the 90s, and he did things that he probably shouldn't have, and he got busted.
Right. Well, and also there's a more profound irony in the sense that, the very thing that he decried was something that he benefited from, which is to say, a kind of corrupt relationship between government and business. So there's no doubt about that. But I think that, the Khodorkovsky story boils down to whether or not you believe that he learned something along the way, and whether he thought, whether it was for his personal interest or not, that it was beneficial for Russia to change, to move to a world where there was less corruption, where there was greater adherence to the rule of law. And I think he was starting to believe that when he was put into prison. But after a number of years in prison, I think he believed it very strongly. And so I do give him credit for a change. I think he did change, both as a human being and in terms of his outlook on how the political economy should be organized.
Yeah, the film talks about this personal transformation that he underwent in prison, and I think he says something along the lines of, I used to believe that life was about what you have, but he realized that life is about what you are. So you believe this change of heart was authentic, huh?
Yeah, he said, I didn't believe that. I used to believe that life was. I realized that life is not about having; it's about being. Well, that's a very Zen-like statement and very un-oligarch-like. It's hard to imagine, for example, if Donald Trump were to be put in prison, that he would come out saying something like that.
Yeah.
He also said, I'm far from an ideal man, but I have ideals. In that sense, I think he was coming to grips with his own failings and his own character flaws, but also invested in a more profound sense of what it means to be both a citizen and a human being.
Mm-hmm. And there's another change that takes place while he's in prison. Initially, right after his conviction, most of the average Russians would have said, good, he was a corrupt oligarch and he belongs in prison. But gradually, public sentiment started to shift. What was the impetus for that?
I think it was really the second trial. When Khodorkovsky was about to come to the end of his sentence, suddenly new charges were trumped up, and these were really ridiculous charges. In this case, having once accused Khodorkovsky of not paying taxes on selling his oil, they now accused him of having stolen all of his own oil, which seems rather nonsensical when you think that they had already charged him for selling it.
Yeah.
Everybody saw through that trial as a kind of a show trial where they brought out evidence of conspiracy, for example, was the company phone book. So in that context, suddenly the people of Russia saw a kind of enormous abuse of power and sense of injustice. And Khodorkovsky was the person who was then fighting back against that injustice. And I think they rallied around him, and popular sentiment turned very much in his direction, so much so that people started demonstrating on his behalf.
I think he got 13 years in prison after that. But things seemed to change around the time of the Sochi Olympics. He was released, I think, just before those Olympics. How did that happen?
There was a lot of international pressure. I mean, Khodorkovsky, spent a number of years writing from prison, being a very active dissident, and being a kind of, it seems a long distance from the ruthless oligarch, but a sort of like a Sakharov-like figure. And that was creating a lot of problems for Putin internationally, where this, very powerful public figure was constantly running down the regime. I think he felt in order to get some sort of international buy-in to the Olympics, it might be good to let him out. Now, he let him out, the same day as Pussy Riot, as if to say they're kind of the same. And Khodorkovsky himself didn't find out that he had been let out until he was watching the news on a prison television set. But I think it was international pressure, and particularly the Germans, Angela Merkel and her foreign minister, were very helpful in terms of pressuring Putin to release him.
Now, all of his assets had been seized, and yet he's now living in London with, I think, about $500 million in the bank. How did he find a way to keep some of his wealth?
Good question. And the details of that I've never been able to discover. I asked Khodorkovsky how much money he still had, and he said 400 million, and another 100 million just got released from Ireland. Now, Yukos had a lot of subsidiaries, money that was stashed outside of Russia, and a number of his executives also were able to get out before Putin clamped down on Yukos and essentially took it over, and placing his own friend in charge of it. So there was money there, and it was money that Khodorkovsky managed to hang on to, even while he was in a Siberian prison.
He's used some of that wealth now to found an activist group called Open Russia, which advocates for political reform in that country. How successful has Open Russia been thus far?
I think it's been a mixed record. I think in terms of sort of on-the-ground agitation, it's not been that successful. And you can kind of I sort of got an upfront view of that when I was in Moscow, just sort of observing how they organize themselves for rallies and so forth and so on. But I think on the other hand, in terms of support for political figures who are trying to raise a ruckus over the lack of democracy in Russia, he's having an impact. And I think he's also having an impact in terms of helping to uncover a lot of stories of corruption and malfeasance in Russia and promoting those in a way that sometimes he takes credit for and sometimes just pops up quietly as in the background evidence for big stories that are being written by major news outlets or TV networks.
And he's also financially supported several opposition candidates who ran against Putin, knowing full well that none of them even remotely stood a chance. In his mind, if they can't win, what is the goal?
I think the goal is to promote democratic values. I mean, you know, in Russia, they call it election theater. And they call it election theater because it's really a fiction. Everybody knows who's going to win, and that is Vladimir Putin. But Khodorkovsky feels that if you promote the idea of elections, even if you ruin your ballot and you go and vote, which is a kind of weirdly quixotic gesture, that's promoting something. You can't give up on the idea of democracy. So it's a weird moment where Khodorkovsky is trying to promote democratic ideals even while admitting that the mechanism of democracy at the moment is completely broken.
And it's easy to see why Russian voters don't take these candidates very seriously. I mean, they call it election theater for a reason. You show how some of the debates devolve into brawls with them yelling and throwing water at each other.
That's right. And one of the candidates, Ksenia Sobchak, who is the daughter of Anatoly Sobchak, who was kind of Putin's great mentor in St. Petersburg when he was coming up, she may have been financed by the Kremlin. There's, I wasn't able to confirm that, but that is the rumor, and that it's a way of sort of propping up the loyal opposition in order to create a veneer of democracy. That said, I will also say that what is interesting about Putin is that he has developed over time a certain political style that does resonate with people, particularly outside of the big cities. When I went to Siberia, we would just ask routinely people, sometimes on camera, sometimes off, what do you think of Putin? And they were almost everybody said, we love Putin. He's made Russia great again.
Well, I mean, it's easy to do when all you hear is pro-Putin statements in the media that's controlled by Vladimir Putin.
I mean, Khodorkovsky, let's say it plain, Khodorkovsky himself is not permitted on television. You're not permitted to show images of Khodorkovsky on television unless it's of him being accused of murder, which is one of the charges they have now leveled against him.
Right. And I want to ask you about Khodorkovsky's own political ambitions. The common narrative that we've heard was that there was this deal between the oligarchs and Vladimir Putin, that Putin would stay out of business and the businessmen would stay out of politics, and that Khodorkovsky sort of broke that rule and that he had ambitions to run for president against Vladimir Putin. Do you think that he was ever serious about running for president? At least in that earlier chapter in his life.
I don't think he was interested in running for president, but I do think he had political ambitions, and I think he was using his money to do what wealthy people do in the United States, which is to heavily influence politicians, let's put it that way, and maybe way beyond that. So, he wanted political impact, and there had been, the term oligarch is a rich man who has political influence, mostly because of his or her money. So, there was no question that Khodorkovsky had political ambitions in the sense that he wanted the system to change. And it may have been to his advantage, but, he was certainly promoting alternatives to Putin.
Hmm.
And Putin took a dim view of that.
Do you think that Vladimir Putin respects Khodorkovsky as a rival?
I wouldn't. I think Putin would say he's not a rival. He's beneath my notice or attention.
Hmm.
But I do think that there is a kind of grudging respect for Khodorkovsky by Putin. And I tell you that, when I went to Russia, when I wanted to talk to either former officials or businessmen about Khodorkovsky on the record, there was noticeable fear about doing so and a reluctance to appear in front of the camera. And so, that testifies to the idea that Khodorkovsky has some pop and some power and has Putin's attention still.
Yeah. And Khodorkovsky actually says that he believes that Putin is weak and fearful. Was that just the typical kind of Russian machismo, or do you think that he really believes that?
Well, that's a good question, and I ponder the question in the film. I think in part it is Russian machismo, but in part he also may be right. I mean, in a world of gangster capitalism, that's a world of favor trading. And favor is a word also that is familiar to Putin, but it's also familiar to Donald Trump.
Right.
The idea is when you can no longer deliver favors to the gangsters around you, then suddenly they come for you. And you don't have that power anymore. So the power is dependent on your ability to continue to trade those favors. And when that dries up, you're in the soup.
You asked Khodorkovsky what is Vladimir Putin's greatest nightmare. What did he say?
Well, this gets to that moment that we're talking about. I asked him that question kind of in a metaphorical way, like what's his nightmare? Like what's his, what's the political bad news for him. But Khodorkovsky weirdly responded in a very concrete way, and he imagined Putin walking through the empty halls of the Kremlin, looking for a phone to use, but all the phones are turned off, and he's waiting for the gangsters to come and get him.
Now, Khodorkovsky is now living in London, but Putin's thugs have a very long reach, so he's hardly safe just because he's out of Russia. And indeed, the UK has been the setting for a number of assassinations and highly suspicious deaths of Putin critics. Does he have a lot of security around him? Does he look behind his back much?
Weirdly, when he goes out, he doesn't take a lot of security with him. And indeed, when I was walking around London with him with our cameras were more noticeable than any security. I couldn't see any security. And so far as I knew, he didn't take any with him. He's kind of made his peace with the idea that if somebody from Russia is going to kill him, they're going to kill him. And they're going to kill him whether or not he has a phalanx of security officials or whether he's out there by himself with his knapsack, which is how I noticed him. Now, sometimes with his family, you see some security people show up, but by and large, he travels on his own.
Did you ask him much about the 2016 election and perhaps even what he might have known about what was going on behind the scenes and how much involvement Putin might have had himself?
He would say, and he did say, that Putin was involved, but he also said that Putin was as shocked and surprised as everyone else when Trump won. That was something completely unexpected.
Really? I wonder, do you think that you still would have made this movie if it hadn't been for Putin's interference in 2016 and so much attention being focused on Putin's Russia right now?
I honestly think it was the impetus for me to make the film. I mean, it would, that kind of reach into our political system and the danger that Putin's Russia poses as a kind of soft authoritarian model. Those were the two things that got me interested in making this movie.
And while you talk about, like you just said, Putin as a soft authoritarian model and his influence in other countries around the world in that sense, you don't bring up Trump in this film. Was that a conscious decision?
It was very conscious not to mention the word Trump once. I wanted this film to be about Russia. That said, I think there are strong metaphorical echoes in this film, and this film functions as a kind of cautionary tale. We could go in this direction if we're not careful. And I think the disrespect for the rule of law, the extraordinary control over the media, and also the attempt to kind of create a post-truth universe in which power is the only thing that matters and truth can no longer speak to it. Those are all things that are very Trumpian.
Now, I want to ask you a little bit about your process before we go. Documentary filmmaking tends to be a reductive process. You end up with so much footage. How do you go about deciding what makes the cut and what doesn't with a film like this?
It's very hard. And the hardest thing of all is getting the structure right, because you have a sense of the story you want to tell, but then, in cinema, you need to lean on your best images, the best sound and the best images. And that means that sometimes the material itself dictates the structure in a way that is different than, say, writing, where you can force the issue a lot better. But as you get a rough structure, over time, the film begins to speak to you. And then sometimes your very favorite scenes have to be dropped to the wayside in order to make way for the emerging momentum of the narrative as it's being constructed by the editor and myself.
And I also want to tell you how much I love the soundtrack for this film. There's some entertaining kind of Russian nostalgia music in here. You have one where it's a group of women singing "I Love Putin," but my favorite—
I Want to Marry Putin.
I Want to Marry Putin. That's what it was, yeah. But my favorite of all is there's some footage in here of Putin backed by a full orchestra singing "I Found My Thrill on Blueberry Hill." Now, this is a guy who didn't want the public to know that he hired an ABBA cover band. Where in the world did you find that clip?
Yeah, it's a great moment. Vladimir Putin meets Fats Domino, and there are a number of American celebrities in the crowd. It's I found my thrill on Blueberry Hill.
Yeah, it was just classic. And before we go, I have to ask: is the film being shown in Russia at all?
Well, we had a private screening, or I should say there was a private screening in Moscow recently sponsored by The Bell, a small investigative journalistic website. I'm told by Khodorkovsky that it's in wide release, but not official wide release, but in the pirated copies on the Russian web.
Okay. So no royalties for you then.
No. No rubles for me.
Yeah. Well, Citizen K is out in theaters starting November 22nd. Alex Gibney, thanks so much for talking with me.
Many thanks, Ben.
Thanks again to Alex Gibney for joining me on the show. His new documentary film, Citizen K, is now out in theaters. Check your local listings for showtimes. And follow Alex on Twitter at @AlexGibneyFilm. If you enjoyed today's podcast, be sure to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and rate and review us while you're there. 5-star ratings and detailed reviews are one of the best ways for new listeners to discover the show. You can also follow us on Facebook or on Twitter at @KickassNewsPod and recommend us to your friends on your social media. For more fun stuff, visit kickassnews.com, and I welcome your comments, questions, and suggestions at comments@kickassnews.com. For now, I'm Ben Mathis, and thanks for listening to Kick-Ass News.